Welcome to Delta Squad.
Where are we going?
Embry Square. Colonel Hoffman's waiting for us.
It's been 9 years since Gears of War first made its appearance on Xbox 360. As the maiden voyage for Unreal Engine 3, Gears of War set a clear graphical bar just 1 year into the last generation. Its success had a great influence on the industry at large that would go on, in part, to shape the development of games from all around the world. It's only fitting then that the return of Gears of War would be heralded not by the industry standard remaster, rather by a full-on remake. But just how do you approach remaking one of the most visually influential games of all time? Developed internally by Microsoft's own Gears of War focused studio known as the Coalition, Gears of War Ultimate Edition is a from-the-ground-up remake of Gears of War for Xbox One. In order to remain as faithful as possible to the source material, the Coalition opted to build upon the original codebase and level structure. The basic map layouts remain identical to the original game, with an entirely new set of assets dropped on top, resulting in a very different look. The idea of rebuilding the game in Unreal Engine 4 was considered, but re-scripting everything in a new engine would have spoiled the original feel of the game. Getting enemy behavior to work just as it did before is no simple task in a new engine. So while it may look completely different, it's Gears of War through and through. Initial impressions are strong. As you first step out into the prison yard, the changes are immediately evident, with intricate stonework, refined lighting, and loads of new details bringing new life to the scene. Minutes later, after touching down in Embry Square, we stop for a moment just to take it all in. The original yellow tint gives way to a new world drenched instead in a nice blue hue. Scraggly trees and crumbling monuments encircle the player, while new textures and materials create a new sense of realism. Every level in the game has been rebuilt using newly re-authored assets created to fit within the confines of the original map layout. Lighting and materials now exhibit increased realism, creating a more believable space. Gears of War Ultimate Edition was built with an emphasis on physically based rendering, enabling materials to interact with light in a more realistic fashion. This is most evident in scenes with highly diffuse materials, such as the earthy stonework that comprises much of the game. Light and shadow also appear more natural thanks to a baked global illumination solution. As much of the game was built on top of the original codebase, it's difficult to say how much of Epic's later work on Unreal Engine made its way into the game. But the results do appear in line with Unreal's light mass global illumination solution. This approach helps create more natural indirect shadows throughout the world. Shadows cast by sunlight are also simulated using a stationary directional light. Working in conjunction with light mass, this enables a pre-computed shadow map to be used across the environment. Looking at Marcus here, you can see an appropriate shadow playing off of his model. Screen space ambient occlusion is also utilized at points. Note the silhouette around Marcus as he makes his way down the hallway. Both games make use of a fairly basic motion blur implementation applied primarily to camera motion. As the player toggles the aiming mode, motion blur is used to accentuate the action. Also, when spinning the camera rapidly, you can see plenty of blur applied to the motion. Pausing here for a moment highlights the increase in quality on Xbox One. It is a bit disappointing that the per-object motion blur that was utilized in Gears of War 3 has not made an appearance in this new version of Gears 1. As expected, new assets were created with a less stringent geometry budget. The original game relied heavily on normal maps to create detail across its simple geometric structures. While this certainly remains true in Gears Ultimate, we also see a lot of additional geometry added to the mix. Note the columns in this scene, littering the environment. On 360 these structures are flat. On Xbox One these same columns feature more complex geometry working with the textures to create a stronger impression of crumbling stone. In addition to basic level layout, the original set of animations are also preserved. This is not true of the game's cutscenes, however, which were remade entirely from scratch. On Xbox 360, the original game primarily utilized real-time cutscenes, yet unlike its sequels, performance was still an issue during these sequences, with plenty of slowdown and tearing rearing its head. The new scenes on Xbox One, however, are entirely pre-rendered. It's disappointing, but at least playback is predictable and sees playback without frame pacing issues. Each of these new scenes were created in Unreal Matinee using in-game assets with effects work cranked up to the max. A high-quality motion blur is used on objects and camera work alike, while bokeh depth of field is used to frame a number of shots. While the changes are appreciated, it does paint the characters in a different light. Scars and blemishes are reduced and animations are often a bit exaggerated, resulting in a very different tone. Sound has also been improved. Take a listen.
This is Private Phoenix. Lieutenant Kim is dead. So we've fallen back inside the tomb and we need a way out of here.
Repeat, Alpha. Kim is dead?
Confirmed, Control. KIA.
We've always appreciated the amount of variety on offer in Gears of War. Each act feels different compared to the last. Act 1, for instance, which we've been looking at thus far, has the player fighting in and around emptied government buildings, courtrooms, and monuments beneath a cloudy mid-afternoon sky. As the curtain on Act 2 is raised, however, Delta Squad now finds themselves knee-deep in the slums at sunset. The first big change noticeable in this scene is its lighting. The original game went for a deep purplish hue throughout the first half of the act, while Ultimate instead opts for a more traditional sunset orange. One benefit of this change is tied to the sun shadow map mentioned earlier. The low-hanging sun casts long shadows across the entire scene, resulting in some dramatic sequences. Making our way through the slums, you'll notice a lot of additional clutter. Rather than relying on flat textures, individual pieces of debris are now modeled and scattered about in a more natural fashion in Gears Ultimate. With every scene being recreated, we also see the developers make changes to scene composition. Take the area ahead, just up the ramp. A derailed train now acts as an explanation as to why players cannot proceed in that direction. This type of detail is a common occurrence in Gears Ultimate and is much appreciated. Another nice improvement can be observed in combat. While firing your weapon, a much improved muzzle flash effect is used, giving weapons a bit more impact. A nice specular effect is also present on each flash, both across the body of the weapon and on Marcus himself. Walking through the stranded quarters, we also see a moodier looking environment with additional shadow casting point lights scattered about. The more realistic approach to lighting is certainly evident. The underside of a bridge at dusk should never be as bright as we see on the 360 side. In fact, shadow casting light sources play quite a large role throughout this stage. In order to escape the swarming krill, for instance, players must remain in the light, which requires them to ignite propane tanks to create such a light source. In one sequence, after setting a car ablaze, Marcus and Dom must quickly follow the burning car as it slides downhill. This scene was first demonstrated all the way back at TGS 2005. As the car slid downhill, its light source was capable of casting shadows across the environment. It's a bit difficult to see in this shot, but the effect was present throughout. When the final game was released, this feature had been removed completely, likely due to performance reasons. With Gears Ultimate, that has been restored. Look closely along the left-hand wall as the car slides down the hill. Note the shadows being cast by the light source. Look again at that same sequence on Xbox 360, and you'll notice the lack of shadows in the same area. In another section, Marcus is tasked with guiding Dom through a darkened region using nothing but a large spotlight. In its original incarnation, the spotlight was only capable of producing a shadow around Dom. In Gears Ultimate, that same light source is now able to project shadows across the entire environment. Note the power lines here. Unfortunately, there is one dramatic effect that has been toned down significantly: the krill. They first appear halfway through Act 2. As the sun sets behind the buildings, a swarm of flying krill are shown pouring out from the ruined skyline. On Xbox 360, this is an amazing looking sequence, with a subtle use of motion blur combined with convincing swarming animations. In comparison, Gears Ultimate feels a bit anemic. The implementation is less impressive, as you can see side by side. The first thing you notice is the addition of a new building blocking out the sun animation completely. Once the krill actually begin pouring into the scene, however, you'll note that they appear in lower numbers and without the same post-processing effects. As a consequence, the end result is much less impressive. Then we come to Act 3, and it's here that the tone shifts even more dramatically. This time, Delta winds up infiltrating a rain-soaked factory during a violent storm. This certainly must have been one of the more difficult stages to remake. The original scene relies heavily on desaturated colors, distance fog, and violent rain effects. Yet on Xbox One, the storm feels more like a light drizzle on a chilly autumn night. Much of the difference lies in the implementation of the rain. In the original game, rain consists of tiled, transparent, double-sided rain textures animated using a simple panning effect. These textures are then placed across the level in order to give the impression of a proper downpour. It's a very simple setup, but it's effective here and gives the impression of a vicious thunderstorm. Gears Ultimate, on the other hand, utilizes a new GPU particle emission system. Individual raindrops are rendered as particles rather than a texture effect, giving them additional depth and realism within the scene. It's a more technically accomplished effect, but its implementation here leaves something to be desired. Also note, during split-screen gameplay, the effect is reduced even more, making it almost seem as if the evening is clear. Atmosphere in this act is also amped up in the original game, using a limited view distance and desaturated colors. This enables all sorts of trickery, including hiding chunks of missing geometry and faking the various materials throughout the level. See, the team was faced with a difficult task here. The unique appearance of the 360 version simply doesn't work well within the physically based pipeline they've created for Gears Ultimate. In order to create a more realistic scene, some of the original atmosphere had to be sacrificed. That's not to say that the stage doesn't still have an impact, it certainly does, but it's one of the few areas where we actually prefer the original version. That said, the base scenery is a lot more detailed overall. Texture work is improved, the frame rate is more consistent, and a lot of new details were added in. Swinging chains, blowing leaves, robust shadows, all of these contribute to a more visually cohesive experience. We even see an appropriate splash texture in place where each droplet intersects the ground. Of course, bodies of water are not handled quite as well. In this scene, the addition of waves seems like a nice idea, but the implementation isn't quite as nice as we'd like. Small pools of water suffer a bit more. Aside from an occasionally visible specular highlight, many pools, such as this one, appear almost flat-shaded. Changes to the scenery aren't always cosmetic either. In some cases, the addition of new objects can have an impact on gameplay as well. In this scene, after diving out from behind a pillar, the addition of a ruined car actually interrupts our forward push. The highway sequence in Act 2 also sees additional debris littered about. Thankfully, the rusty old bucket manages to plow right through everything with ease. Plus, the krill actually seem to do less damage here. Another nice detail we noted is the inclusion of translucent shadows. In several sequences, stained glass windows project colored shadows across character models. While absent in the original game, this feature was demonstrated in one of the first Unreal Engine 3 public showings. it's nice to see it return. There were a couple of times where our progress was stalled actually in Gears Ultimate. In one scene, after clearing out the room, we waited around for enemies that never came. Reloading the last checkpoint fixed the issue, but it's a strange occurrence nonetheless. Performance-wise, the campaign is designed to operate at 30 frames per second, while multiplayer actually makes the jump to 60. It's a bit jarring switching back and forth between the two actually, but at least the campaign holds its target frame rate most of the time, unlike the original game. Multiplayer 2 does a good job maintaining its 60 frames per second update, and we noted less tearing and slowdown in the final game as opposed to the original beta. In the end, Gears of War Ultimate is a worthy remake of the original game. It feels like a perfect blend of the visual language defined in Gears of War while taking advantage of the wider color palette established in later entries. It's hard to imagine going back to the monochromatic look of the original game after experiencing Gears of War 3. In that sense, it feels like an artist revisiting his first piece after years of experience. It's a perfect blend of the new and the old, and it still holds up brilliantly today. Of course, for the purist, the entire selection of the Xbox 360 Gears titles are being made available to owners of the Gears Ultimate Collection, enabling you to revisit each one of them thanks to backwards compatibility. That's all for now. Be sure to check out the full article on the site. And if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and click subscribe below.